The coalition of the willing strikes again. It almost sounds like a bad play on the Star Wars, the Empire Strikes Back or so. But at least in that case, I mean, the Empire actually was a formidable force. In this case, it might actually be more appropriate to say that the Europeans strike out, because the direction that they're going and the things that they're saying continue to make peace not only more unlikely, but to make a conflict on the battlefield turn to be the decisive way that the war will end. And it's just not leaving the Russians much of a choice. And that's just the hardcore reality. We're going to show you that today. And there's nobody better to decipher some of this stuff than Colonel Doug McGregor, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, defense and foreign policy analyst, and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, as always, pleasure to have you here.
Happy to be here, Dan.
Well, let's just jump right into it. There was some meetings this morning, our time anyway, in Paris, where Macron was hosting Zelenskyy and Ursula von der Leyen and a number of other European leaders, and then another 20 joined in via VTC. So it was kind of a big confab, yet another one. This was supposed to be followed by a phone call then with President Trump in Washington here, and we'll get into some of the comments there in a minute ago. But first of all, I just kind of want your view on where you see the Europeans coming at this, because all the things that have been said, and after Alaska, after the meeting in Washington, and all the things that have happened since that time, and yet they met today in Paris, and I don't hear a lot different in what they're saying.
No, I think that's right, but I think they've boxed themselves in a way that's extremely unhelpful. But we have to back off a minute, and we can't just view what's happening in Ukraine in isolation of what's happening, frankly, in Western Europe. We know that Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is in a lot of trouble. He's clinging very precariously to power right now. The population, let's face it, is practically in rebellion against a government and a state that is determined to destroy them in favor of recently arrived immigrants who, frankly, aren't British, don't want to be British, will never be British. And that's not going to work very well. The situation in France is at least as bad, in some ways worse. Both Britain and France are practically insolvent. I don't see how they're going to sustain themselves too much longer financially. And then you're bringing in people like Tusk from Poland. Tusk is a globalist, just like Macron and Starmer. And then, of course, von der Leyen is absolutely indistinguishable from Klaus Schwab or Larry Fink. These are the people that want, the giant surveillance state to make sure that you and I express the right opinions. And anybody that raises objections to what any of these globalists want to do inside our countries is deemed to be an extremist. And any form of speech that deviates from their wishes is extreme speech and has to be suppressed. So let's look at the catastrophic conditions, in my judgment, that you have in Europe. Now, the people that are responsible for these catastrophic decisions or conditions and are ultimately going to be removed by them are the ones that are saying, well, we have to go forward and win the war in Ukraine, which is not just a contradiction, it's absurd. There is no chance whatsoever for this Ukrainian regime in Kiev to field any sort of force that is capable of defeating the Russians. And the Russians have made their case. They have tried to outline their legitimate security interests, and at every turn they've been rejected. We just don't listen to them. Trump went to Alaska and apparently either didn't understand what he was being told or just decided he didn't like it. So the other thing that's happening, in addition to the slow sort of disintegration of the West European governments that I mentioned, is that the world is dividing into two hemispheres. Now, one hemisphere, which is the hemisphere you and I live in, plus Europe, seems to be determined, and I'm talking largely about North America, seems to be determined to live in isolation from the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has said, fine, we'll live in isolation from you. We'll build our own parallel institutions, our own alternative to the SWIFT system, which the Chinese have created and to all reports seems to work better than our own. And by the way, our money is going to be meaningful because it's going to be backed by gold and potentially other commodities. In the meantime, we're sitting here on a ticking time bomb, a $9 trillion bill that has to be paid off at the end of the year or we face default. This is interest on our wonderful sovereign national debt that we can't retire. So this division into two worlds is probably now unavoidable and permanent. So we're not really talking to the people on the other side. We're not talking to China. We're not talking to Beijing or Moscow. We're not talking to anybody in Tehran. We're not talking to anybody in Delhi anymore. We're talking to ourselves. And we're quite convinced that we're right, everyone else is wrong, and everyone else should do what we tell them to do. It's almost Kafkaesque.
Yeah, and definitely frustrating-ish. No question about that, because these things, these trends you're talking about are not hard to see, at least for people willing to just look at things as they are. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of willingness at the leader level to see things as they are. And let's first of all take a look at this. This is what President Trump is reported to have said after the meeting that they just held here, according to The Hill. It says President Trump emphasized that Europe must stop purchasing Russian oil that is funding the war, as Russia receives over $1 billion in fuel sales from the EU in 1 year, a White House statement said. The president also emphasized that European leaders must place economic pressure on China for funding war efforts. And Doug, I mean, I just got to say that those are both nearly impossible tasks. There's a reason why the Europeans haven't stopped buying Russian oil so far, even though all during this war. And there's, especially in light of the BRICS, of the SCO meeting, and of China's big celebration in Beijing yesterday, there is zero chance that you're going to successfully pressure China into doing anything against Russia. What do you make of these kinds of statements coming out of the White House?
Well, this is unfortunately consistent, not just with President Trump and everything he's been saying and doing, but frankly, everything that his predecessor said and did. At every turn, our answer to the Russians, and whenever they expressed their views on anything, and whenever they tried to explain their legitimate national security interests, whenever they talked about a new security architecture, one in which Russian security, German security, anyone's security in Europe would not be purchased at the expense of anyone else. And what did we answer? We answered with escalation. We've continued to provide the Ukrainians with the means to attack Russia on Russian soil. We have been behind or had our hands in all of the quote unquote modest, successful strategic strikes that certainly garnered a great deal of attention, but did nothing to alter the course of the war. These are the drone strikes on the Russian strategic bombers, the most recent ones against the gasification refinery plants in Russia. None of these things were crippling in a strategic sense. None of these are altering the course of events. But they seem to create the illusion in the minds of the people that launched them that there's life in this regime in Kiev. In the meantime, as I think you pointed out some time ago, we just watched something in the neighborhood of 13,000 Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 25 leave the country, conveying the impression that the Ukrainian government has decided that if they don't let these people go, they too will be murdered on the battlefield, because there's no alternative to that right now. They're dealing with a military machine they cannot resist. And so perhaps it's prudent to let them leave in the hopes that at some point they can come back and repopulate Ukraine. I don't know. I'm speculating. But the whole picture is ridiculous. We continue down a path that has no chance of success, but it's doing a damn fine job of alienating the rest of the world. And that's what we saw in China over the last few days. And by the way, all that Chinese military might that was on display was not aimed at us. It was simply a clear and unambiguous signal that we cannot be bullied. You can't bully us into submission. You can't force us into any sort of arrangement that is not in our interest. And by the way, they haven't said anything or done anything to suggest that they want to harm us. We're the ones insisting that their success in any way, shape, or form is harming us. I mean, stop and consider this. We've spent what, between $8 and $14 trillion since 2001 on all of these catastrophic military strategic failures. Just stop and think about that sum. The Chinese have invested perhaps $1 trillion in building up the infrastructure for the One Belt, One Road that basically is designed to connect everyone on the Eurasian continent and Africa back to China and vice versa. In other words, a new commercial structure beyond anything that was conceived of under the Mongolian Empire in terms of commercial ties between East and West. Something beyond anything we've seen, certainly since the end of the Second World War, that promises to create enormous prosperity all over Eurasia and potentially Africa in time. And we are treating that as catastrophic. Something has to be resisted. Something has to be broken because we are not in charge of it. It's not our idea. We didn't think of it. And we utterly refuse to be part of anything that we do not dominate. That's essentially what it comes down to. So Donald Trump, for all of his rhetoric about, settling conflicts and promoting peace and prosperity, is in the same business as his predecessor, trying to cling to the impossible position of global military hegemony run from Washington.
And that's expired. The use by date has passed, and instead of recognizing that, we just keep going down a bad and fruitless path. That's also mirrored to a large extent in Europe. I'm going to get to a bit of that in a second, but let's first start with Zelenskyy, because he's kind of deepened and dug into his trench a little bit deeper. Here's what he had to say after talking with President Trump. This is on his X account here, if you can pop that one up there. Basically, he's kind of reiterating one of the things that he said really all throughout this war, and took the opportunity again to say, he said, first and foremost, we talked about how to push the situation towards real peace. We discussed different options. The most important is pressure, using strong measures, particularly economic ones, to force an end to the war. The key to peace is driving Russia's war machine, or depriving it of money, depriving it of resources. And then he also adds, we also spoke about the maximum protection for Ukraine's skies. Until peace comes, Ukraine must not be at the mercy of constant Russian attacks. Russian missiles and drones must not take lives. Ukraine has proposed a format for protecting our skies for the U.S. to consider. So he wants some version of a air cover from the United States. And then instead of putting pressure on anyone else, he wants pressure on Russia alone, economics, which is ironic because President Trump announced right before this that he wanted to put pressure on Europe to stop buying Russian oil, and then also on China and presumably India, since he's got sanctions on them. But Zelensky's not even on the same page as Trump, because Trump didn't say anything about pressure on Russia so far. What do you think?
I think that Zelensky's prescription is global thermonuclear war launched by the United States against Russia. It's insane. It makes no sense. And my great fear is that there are people in Washington that don't understand that that is the inevitable outcome if we don't take the off-ramp and get off of this dead-end road that we're on with Zelenskyy, because that's what he wants. He just doesn't want Europe to support him. He wants us to make it impossible for Russia to defeat him or anyone else. Well, that's not going to happen. We have no interest in that. And I think that President Trump foolishly listens to this man, and obviously to people around him, who tell him that we are more powerful than we are, that we are in a position to dictate terms, which we're not. And this man Zelenskyy is evidence for all of that kind of thinking. So the real question at this stage is, President Trump, what are you going to do to extricate the United States from this utterly pointless and fruitless policy that you inherited from President Biden? Thus far, his answer is nothing. I'm going to keep it up. I'm going to continue to do it. And if you really want to push this to the limits, you will end up in a nuclear exchange with Russia. The Russians have been very straightforward. We understand the conditions that they've described. None of those are unacceptable, frankly, to us. We do not lose as a result of supporting neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. We don't lose with a government in Kiev that is at least not hostile, if not aligned with Moscow. We lose if we are dragged into a war over a part of the world that is of no strategic importance to us against Russia. That's how we lose. And what you saw again over in China was a group of people, what is it, more than 40% of the world's population, and probably at least half of its natural resources, mineral wealth, oil, gas, you name it. We saw a demonstration that they have all gotten together and said, we would like to have peace in our time with the United States, but we will not submit to Donald Trump's bullying tactics. So he's got to make a decision. Where does he want to take us? Further and further down the road to disaster and potential war? Or does he want to get off the train, go somewhere else in a new direction? But see, this is also bound up with this financial system that we built after the Second World War, which is crumbling. We went to Bretton Woods. We went off the gold standard. We have taken this thing called fiat currency, which has no real value except what we impute to it. And most of that depends on trust in the United States government. Well, I think trust in the United States government is hit an all-time low, both overseas and here at home. So the question is, what are we going to do as this crumbles in front of us? Do we simply sink into a depression? Do we restructure the debt? No, nobody goes there. No, we give Besant orders from the White House. Find a new scam, some new means to get around reality. So he's turned to these treasury bills. The whole idea of reevaluating or revaluing gold has gone down the toilet. And part of that, at least, is because no one really knows what we've got. All we know is that the Germans and the Italians who've asked to repatriate their gold, we've told them, no, we're not repatriating all of it. So the question is, well, why not? The suspicion is we don't have it all. You see where I'm going? In other words, we're talking about the Ukraine war, but the Ukraine war that is mightily our responsibility. We built it up. We created the forces in Ukraine. We sent them into action. We've bled the country white. And yet Trump acts as though this is something that happens somewhere else that has nothing to do with us, which of course is absurd. So we've done that. We're in very serious financial trouble. You can't view one in isolation from the other. So if we stay on this track, the question is, which happens first? Are we dragged into an unnecessary self-defeating collision with the Russians on the strategic level, which could invite a nuclear exchange? Or the alternative right now is to continue on the current path and go down financially into total and complete ruin, into something worse than the Depression of the 1930s. So which is it? Which comes first? I'm not an expert, but I think it's pretty clear that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because there ought to be a third option there, or we can acknowledge reality, cut off this bad deal, to use Trump's terminology there, and just cauterize that wound and start getting back into something in a more normalized relations, which might forestall some of the economic stuff. It may be too late for that, but at least there's an option. But that doesn't appear to be on the table. Ironically, it seems that Vladimir Putin is trying to give Trump an off-ramp by countering one of the biggest accusations that the West makes against Russia, which is always that we got to stop them here because otherwise they're going to roll into France and the UK, which their leaders have said in just the last couple of weeks here. Putin addressed that thing yesterday in Beijing.
As for if the multipolar world has been established or not, well, its outlines are there by and large, but I wouldn't really speak about any domineering poles. It doesn't mean that this new multipolar world should have any hegemons, because no one is speaking about this, not in BRICS, not in the SCO. Everyone has equal rights in this multipolar world. And from international law point of view, everyone must have equal rights, must be in the similar position. Yes, there are economic giants like India or China, and actually our country is among top 4 biggest economies if we speak about purchasing power narrative. These are the current realities. That's not something that we would like to have. That's what international organizations calculate, but it doesn't mean that anyone should dominate over the politics or over global security.
So you see that President Putin there is saying, listen, hey, we're not trying to dominate anyone. We're not trying to, even within BRICS, we're not trying to have this counterweight to the Western way of thinking. We're actually saying it's a multipolar world, and you're one of the poles. So we can continue going down that path, but everyone's going to have equal rights here. So this whole idea that we're getting up and having this big economic and maybe a military bloc in order to, come after you is not true. They don't have any interest in doing that. And Doug, as you said just a minute ago, China is more interested in doing business than they are in conquering anybody.
Well, again, there's an unwillingness. In fact, it was a good report that Dan Grazier just put out talking about the high improbability of any Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which gets all the attention that you can imagine. I think we've lost our touch with reality. China is a nation of 1.4 billion. Every morning Xi wakes up and his number one concern is, how do I hold this country together? People don't understand that. China is got 4 or 5 versions of a nation like the United States within its borders. This is not an easy thing to control. In fact, this is one of the myths that is widespread in the West, that this man Xi is the ultimate super dictator who controls everything, everywhere, all the time. No, in fact, his biggest problem is that he doesn't. And one of the reasons he was appointed to the job was to tackle the biggest problem they face, which is still corruption inside Chinese society. And that corruption has led to the mass don't want to say mass, but the execution and imprisonment of untold numbers of senior officials in the Chinese government, in the military. There are more problems inside China than people in the West appreciate. So and then the false notion, because we project onto China the Western experience, is that, well, to fix these problems, Xi needs a war. The last thing Xi needs is a war. They have just been embarked on the largest building program in human history, certainly since the 1990s. So let's just say 25 years, building cities, building platforms, building transportation, as you name it. If you're interested in doing that sort of thing, the last thing on your mind is what? War. Because what promises to destroy all of that is a war. So there just isn't the evidence for this overwhelming Chinese threat that is like the sword of Damocles hanging over our heads. It's just unreal. But unfortunately, that falls on deaf ears. You have this sort of cyclical predisposition to spend lavishly on defense. And by the way, our return on investment is not very good. We spend more for everything that we have in defense than almost any other country in the world. And then this in turn enriches large numbers of people in Washington. Yes, it does keep assembly lines open in many places. But the biggest beneficiaries are the people that are the quote unquote shareholders. And they have no real interest in peace. And so they are happy to advocate for conflict. And if you look at all the people at the top of the military, no one is stepping forward asking any questions about, well, strategically, would it not make sense for us not to provoke, not to intervene? Did anyone stand up and raise questions about our decision to send this flotilla towards Venezuela? This looks like another Trump exercise insofar as there's no underlying planning or thinking, as far as I can tell. He wakes up, well, we're going to make a point. We're going to make an example out of these people. I want to get rid of Maduro or something. And suddenly everyone is on board and says, yeah, let's sail down to the Caribbean. It was supposed to take 2 days to assemble. It took many, many days to assemble everything because there was no adequate planning, no operational thinking. Strategically, we have yet to figure out what these people are supposed to do. Well, I'm 100% for using the U.S. military in the Western Hemisphere to defend us, to defend our interests. But I don't think the use of the U.S. military in the Caribbean to attack Latin American states is necessarily a good idea. There are always second and third effects associated with any military operation. Venezuela is not a robust and powerful state. We all know that.
Right.
Its society is not necessarily very cohesive, although I would argue we forced a lot of cohesion on them in the last few days.
Yep.
That very clearly. But the point is, how does it help us to do this? What difference does it make who is running Venezuela? Are we treating symptoms or are we treating the disease? Well, the disease is here at home. It's we've got to control our borders, control the coastal waters, control airports, get at the people who are bringing the material into the country that's killing us. But we've also have to go after the people peddling the drugs here inside the country. We have to do effectively what Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore. And he had a death penalty. If you bring drugs in, if you try to peddle drugs, you face capital punishment. You know what? It worked. But if you bring it up right now, oh, that's terrible. We can never do that. Well, if you're going to take that position, we may not have a society, because a society that can't enforce laws like that and protect its own population isn't going to last. So instead of invading Venezuela at this point, which I think is a complete waste of time, or blowing up a boat in the ocean that's carrying drugs, and you know, from your time on active duty, I do, from having worked down at Joint Integrated Task Force South, GIATF South, that a lot of this stuff comes in much more sophisticated ways to the United States.
Right.
Blowing up this one boat is going to make a damn bit of a difference. But again, it falls into that category that is so important to Donald Trump. Optics.
Yeah.
See, I'm tough. I took guts to go and order somebody to blow a boat up. No, it strictly speaking, it falls into the category of extrajudicial assassination or murder. It's not strictly legal. Just because the president says, well, these people are terrorists, doesn't necessarily make them terrorists. Do terrorists and drug cartels cooperate? Of course they do. Does it mean everyone in the drug cartel is a terrorist? Does it mean everyone involved with terrorism is a drug peddler? No. These things do matter. The distinctions do matter. And remember, if we know that we're dealing with fragile state structures, if we know that Maduro has very little influence over his own armed forces, he really doesn't, which is not necessarily a good thing, but that's true. We know the president of Mexico has no authority over the Mexican armed forces. The Mexican army is under the control of the drug cartels. Wake up. That's what you're dealing with down there. Now, is the solution to destroy Mexico? I don't think so. I think you have to accept what you're dealing with, recognize what it is, but then you have to also look inwardly. It's one thing we have to defend ourselves against it on the outside. Taking the offense into some other person's society or state is not necessarily a good idea. We have to take the offense inside our country, go after what's inside the country first. And I think to some extent, that's something that Donald Trump would like to do. I don't think anybody's outlined it for him in a way that makes sense. So, you know, on the one hand, we have this ongoing war against Ukraine that really should end as soon as we can find a way to end it, which means let's look at the Russian conditions. Let's sign up minimally for what Putin has said he wants. He wants a neutral Ukraine.
Well, and I want to go back to that conversation you had, or that press conference you had in Beijing yesterday, because there was a couple of other things of note, but one really big one, to where if I argued that he was trying to give Trump a hand by saying, hey, we're not actually trying to go after anybody else, he also showed that there's some limitations on that, because he said we are doing everything we can for negotiations, but if they fail, he said this.
I still believe that if common sense prevails, that an agreement on acceptable way to put an end to this conflict. It is possible. And since we can see the sentiments in the U.S. administration under the leadership of Trump, so we don't hear just mere statements, so we see the sincere desire to find a solution. And I believe there is light in the end of the tunnel. So we will see how the situation develops, how it unfolds. Well, if not, then we will have to accomplish our goals via military means.
So he was very matter-of-factly there, not even mincing words anywhere. He said, yeah, we care about President Trump. We were happy to be working with him. We're looking for solutions. But if we don't find the solutions, there is another one on the table, and we will simply continue to go until we get our military objectives met via military, meaning they'll simply win the war. Is that just him making a bunch of statements and trying to look tough, or do you think he means it?
No, I think he's absolutely serious. And we have to understand there's tremendous pressure on him at home. Everybody talks about Vladimir Putin, the dictator. It's very misleading. He looks at the opinion polls. He listens to the Russian people. Let me tell you something. The Russian people want this war to end on the terms that he's outlined. And they don't care if they have to march all the way to the Polish border. Now, that's something that Putin has never wanted to do. He's stayed focused on Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, essentially Novorossiya, New Russia. And that's laudable, but I think he's coming around to understanding that we're not going to do business with him. It doesn't make any difference what he says. President Trump doesn't understand, and President Trump is only interested in what President Trump benefits from. He's personally invested in what he thinks is important for himself. And that's not a good way forward in international relations. You have to think in terms of the broader community of states and nations. You have to think in terms of your own standard of living, your economic health. Trump is not there, and I think Putin knows that. So he's just going to plow ahead. Now, he has something very important working for him, and we in the United States are not paying nearly enough attention to this. Von der Leyen is standing on thin ice. She could be removed any day. Everyone in Europe has had it with the European Union. People do not want to be ruled from Brussels. What Orban began, and what FICO has joined, and I think others are joining very rapidly, is this recognition this all needs to stop. And they're not going to take orders anymore from the EU. The EU is dying. NATO is sort of a long column of cars in a clown show, and they're all chugging along and making noise, but the engines really don't drive very well. There's lots of smoke and fire, but there's nothing to it. NATO is doomed. It's a waste of time. So I think these are the things that we need to be honest about. We refuse to be honest about them. Instead, we treat everything as though it's solid gold. Nothing can change. The world of the future will look like the world of the past. And at some point, it's going to be impossible to conceal these facts from the American people. And it's going to happen soon. I don't know where it starts. I always thought it would start in France and then spread. It may start now in Great Britain. I mean, their economy is definitely tanking. We're linked to it very closely. The banks in London and the banks in New York City are intimately familiar with each other and inextricably intertwined. All of this is coming to a head.
You know, it's interesting, Doug, if Putin is trying to give a lifeline to Trump to try to reach across to bring this to an end, and Trump is having these meetings, which he had in the Oval Office with all the European leaders following Alaska, and then this VTC that he had today, it doesn't look like the European leaders are trying to find any common ground with Trump. In fact, it looks like they're trying to undermine him. Here is German Chancellor Merz giving his opinion on Vladimir Putin just a day ago.
He is a war criminal. He is perhaps the most serious war criminal of our time that we are currently seeing on a large scale. And we simply have to be clear about how to deal with war criminals.
So, yeah, we have to be clear about how to deal with war criminals. I mean, I don't know what he actually means when he says we have to deal with them, but I mean, the implication being you can't make a deal with them. if he's a convicted or, a real war criminal, you don't want to make a deal with him and let him, off scot-free. What does this tell you about what the European mentality is?
Well, we got to be careful about what the European mentality is, because again, we're talking about the globalist regimes in Berlin, Paris, and London. So, like Merz sees value in China's use of digital ID systems. This supports his desired mechanism of social governance. In other words, digital transformation, cultural, political uniformity, and global governments, these things go together. That's what he's striving to achieve. But he's dealing with a population in Germany, just as Macron is in France and Starmer in Great Britain, that they don't want this. In other words, they want to live in freedom. They want free speech. They don't want to be governed from Brussels. So Merz is standing there preaching this nonsense, and the only people who are listening attentively to it are the people that you saw on television and in the networks, which are ultimately in the hands of the state anyway, which is one of the problems in Germany. State-owned media. I mean, we have a problem with media in our country because they're owned by people that want us involved in these catastrophes, but at least they're not yet state-owned. His state-owned media is supporting this nonsense, but people are figuring it out. I mean, Poland's another great example. Tusk wants to go down, with Ukraine into the dustbin of history. He wants to die with the rest of these fools, but the Polish people don't. And the new president, Nawrocki, doesn't want to do that. It's changing. I guess my bottom line point is all of this is going to change in the very near future. We need to exercise a little patience. Putin, not Trump, is going to get what he wants because new leadership will emerge. The vacuum that ensues is going to be filled by nationalists. You have a party now in the Czech Republic called the Party of Discontented Citizens. It's got 30% of the vote.
Wow.
You have a similar situation in Germany with the Alternative for Germany, despite the fact that 6 politicians miraculously from the Alternative for Germany were all murdered within the last few days.
Oh,
big
wow.
question is asking, well, what killed these people? They're saying natural causes. Most people think they were murdered. That's the tip of the iceberg. In other words, all of these terrible politicians that have bankrupted their countries, dragged them into a war they didn't need to fight against a state that really wasn't their enemy, Russia. All of this has resulted in deindustrialization and economic collapse. They're going to be swept away. It's over. I think Putin knows that. He's waiting, and that's one of the reasons he doesn't want to have to move any further west. He's never been interested in ruling Western Ukraine. My God, that would be an horrific nightmare. Everyone knows what the Western Ukrainians are like and what they want, what they don't want. They have been ferocious in war and in peace against their enemies, whether they were Polish or Russian or anybody else. He doesn't want anything to do with that. What he would like to see is a self-governing, neutral Ukraine that is not hostile to Russia. That's what he wants. We are doing everything we can to prevent that. That will not end well for us. And that goes back to the original point. What do we want? Well, I think the American people want nothing to do with any of it, frankly. I think Americans are worried about inflation, and inflation. I think they are upset with the lack of law enforcement across the country. Not the failure of police to enforce the law, but the inability of the police to enforce the law, because you have thousands of attorneys working hard to prevent law enforcement from succeeding. Now, this didn't all happen under Donald Trump. This has been building for years. But these are the things that Americans are worried about. And they want jobs. They want to earn a living. They want to be able to pay for gasoline and food. We all know that. They're not interested in going to war with Russia over this place called Ukraine. Neither are most Europeans.
Some of the European leaders do. Gary, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. I want to go to the one that we have labeled Macron 1, because he's talking about not even looking for ways to find an off-ramp for this. If Merz was, trying to stir the pot up of antagonism with Russia by calling Putin a war criminal, Macron seems to be focused solely on extending and expanding the war.
There are 26 countries who have formally made pledges, who have committed to provide additional forces in Ukraine where needed, be it on the land, in the air, or by sea, to provide, again, further support to Ukraine and to Ukrainians until a ceasefire or peace can be found.
That's obviously absurd. You're not going to find a ceasefire or an end of war with those kinds of terms, and yet that's the only thing on the table for Ukraine, for Europe.
When did World War I end? It ended after a peace was negotiated and a time and date was set for the end of hostilities. In other words, there was not a ceasefire while people met and decided what to do. The fighting continued until 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th of November, 1918. We need to understand that. No one is going to stop fighting unless there is evidence for a tangible, endurable peace of some kind. That can be negotiated. The Russians have made that very clear. We need to step up and support that. And then I say this all the time, but people don't understand it. The people with the most invested in this are the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Romanians, and the people in Moldova. They live on the edge of the abyss. They're watching this tragedy unfold across the street. Their neighbors. Where are they? Who represents them at the table? All we do is listen to Paris, London, and Berlin.
Yeah.
And this horrible situation in Brussels is von der Leyen and her gang. The hell with those people. They don't live with the problem. The problem is to the east. The people that live on the border with Ukraine and potentially Russia are the ones with the most interest. They need to step up too. We can support that. We used to be about self-determination. I recall at least one American president that talked about self-determination. Everybody else over the last 20 or 30 years has talked about us leading everybody in the world, whether they like it or not. We need to get back to the idea of self-determination. The people that live there need to determine the outcome. Who's going to step up and support that? That's what President Trump should be talking about. But I never hear it. It's as though he thinks he's the emperor of the world. And the message in China was, no, you're not. We're not even in your world anymore. We have our own financial system. We're going to have our own way of doing business. And if you don't like it, it's fine. We don't need to trade with you. You are not the indispensable trading partner you once were. We can do this on our own. And our answer to that is what? Threats. Makes no sense at all.
Yeah, and I think we may find to our pain that one day it is we who can't do without them rather than the other way around. And doesn't have to get to that point, but it does seem like we're on the path there. In fact, I kind of as a wrap up to this section here, given where all the parties are, and that means Trump, Zelenskyy, Europe, and Putin, like four corners of a boxing ring, do you see any prospect that this war can be over anytime soon, whether militarily or diplomatically?
I think the war could end this year. The war could end in 2 weeks. It could end in a month. And not necessarily simply because Russian forces crossed the Dnieper in advance. It could end because the Europeans recognize that it will not end unless they end it. We're no longer capable of ending anything. We can reinforce failure. We can cultivate more chaos and destruction. That's what the National Endowment for Democracy as a front for the CIA has done. That's what USAID has done. But we're not capable of walking in and helping people find a way out of this. That's the sad tragedy. The same is true in the Middle East. We have made ourselves not just part of the problem, but one of the main problems. So I think it all depends on the people in Europe. I think they need to get rid of these governments. I think they can rise up and do that. But in a place like Germany, which is arguably the most important state in Europe, you now have Merz and his friends who want to run around and arrest anybody that disagrees with them, that sees any divergence from their globalist agenda, which is catastrophic for the German people, as the enemy. And I think he has to be removed. So I've reached the point now where when I talk to my friends in Europe, and I lived 10 years of my life over there, 8 of it in Germany, I tell them, you've got to rise up and liberate yourselves from these people. They're a catastrophe. And we are of no help because we have no interest in seeing an independent, capable Europe emerge. I don't think we ever have. We very much liked vassalized European states, dependent upon us that would do as we ordered them to do. Well, the proverbial chickens have come home to roost. It's time to get out from under us. And we should welcome the opportunity to disengage from them. They need to determine their destiny, not us. And they can do that because Putin is not marching west into their countries. Doesn't want to go there. No one in their right mind would.
Indeed. Before I let you go here, I want to look at a related thing. You mentioned earlier in this episode here about how you hope we don't get into a situation where we get into an actual confrontation with Russia because it could all too easily go nuclear and then everybody loses at that point. But there is a possibility that we could have it underneath that threshold. It would be hard to do, but it's still possible to fight at the conventional level, meaning it could go not all the way to complete catastrophic. But I want to look at what would happen if we fought at the conventional level. Now, when you look at these parades that have happened from the U.S., Russia and China here in the last few days, now, obviously, these things are, you can choreograph a lot of stuff, and what somebody looks good in a parade doesn't necessarily translate into combat capability. But I do want to look at here. You're seeing the Russians here. This is from their May 9th parade. And then in a minute, you're going to see the U.S. version of that in June. And then the last part here, we're going to see in the Chinese parade here. What, if anything, can we gather about the actual combat capability? Should conventional war include any or all of these in some sort of the conventional conflict? What does this tell you? Anything?
Well, if you look at the performance by the Chinese and Russian forces and the forces that participated in their respective parades, they all look very good. They conveyed the impression of discipline, organization, and so forth. Look at look at this sort of thing. It's not very professional. And obviously it's nice that people are happy and smiling. But
this imagery here, Doug, this one just really kills me because it looks like we're just, creeping along here as opposed to these, formations that were coming on both the Chinese and the Russian side. I just kind of cringe. And then you're going to see us walking, not even in formation here in a second. It's really kind of cringeworthy.
Well, I think that's exactly right. It is cringeworthy. These people look at the way they're dressed, look at the way they move. Look, we know that discipline is at a low point in the armed forces. We place a lot of value on things, but not nearly as much on discipline. People say, well, it doesn't matter what happens on the parade ground. It's interesting to note that when forces were prepared to go fight on the continent, British forces, Churchill made a point of going out to inspect them and see them. He wanted to see them pass in review because he knew it reflected a level of discipline, responsiveness to leadership, attention to detail that would carry over into professional military performance in combat. We don't understand that. We underestimate it. We don't value it. And it's wrong to do so. And so we have something that looks like a volunteer fire department on parade half the time. And that doesn't impress the American public. Some people are impressed because they don't know any better. I've watched some parades in recent years at the service academies and was deeply disappointed at the performance. These things matter. Discipline manifests itself in many, many ways. I remember years ago when I was a plebe at West Point, we were going through one of these endless inspections in the summer before the academic year began. And we hadn't done badly in my room. My roommate and I did pretty well, but we had neglected to fold the towels, believe it or not, in the prescribed fashion. And one of them was dirty. And in walked a major, and he later became a 4-star. His name was Zhao. And Zhao was an interesting guy. I mean,
I met him once.
Yeah, but he walked in, Major Zhao, and he walked around the room, and he did not miss anything. And he instantly found the towels. He pulled the towels off, and he said, "Gentlemen, attention to detail is the mark of a West Point graduate. The discipline it takes to fold your towel properly is reflected in everything that you do." Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We all thought, well, now we're screwed. He's going to give us demerits. We can kiss our life goodbye over the next 2 days. Fortunately, he did not, and we were grateful for that. He was serious. Whether or not you liked Zhao or thought he was a great general or a great man is neither here nor there. He was right. He was correct. All of that was missing from that parade in June. I was deeply upset by it and angered by it. I think many of us were that saw that. It's disgraceful. You know, when these parades are staged and executed in Moscow and Beijing, they spend weeks preparing for this. You go to the Trooping of the Color on the Queen's official birthday in June every year. They practice for 2-3 months sometimes before that's executed because it matters. The exhibition of discipline and performance matters. And my only comment is that we are far from where we need to be. Let's put it that way. And I'm not saying that the Chinese or the Russians or anybody else is perfect. We all have our problems. But the manifestation of discipline and performance in those settings is a reflection on the nation. And it's a matter of national pride. I think that's lacking with us right now. It needs to be rebuilt badly.
Yeah, you know, I have a similar experience, actually, that of myself, and I can confirm that it does matter. I joined as a private back in 1985 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and during my basic training period, a similar situation happened where we had this inspection, and one of my socks was not folded correctly. It wasn't even a towel; it was just one sock in a drawer. And so the drill sergeant came in and literally just trashed the entire place. And of course, we had to stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning until we could get everything back into order. And he'd pull some of it out into the hallway, et cetera, just to reinforce. And I promise you that message was clear that the attention to detail mattered. And that did translate into across the board what we were doing. And that's the Army that when I first met you, actually in 1989, or I think 1990, at the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, when I showed up, that was still the mentality then. And attention to detail mattered, et cetera. I don't see that as much. And I got out in 2015, so it's been a while since I've seen firsthand. But what I have seen is and we saw on display right there this very summer, they just don't seem to be concerned about that. No one seemed bothered by the fact that in that last clip there, guys were physically out of step, and no one seemed bothered by it.
Well, Dan, I think that drill sergeant knew that you were from Texas and you deserved it.
Well, I can't deny that. I'm pretty sure that's the case. He was a Vietnam vet, by the way, and a hardcore guy, which I hated him at the time, loved him ever since, but I'm sure that's right.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, listen, thanks so much. Good to talk with you.
Well, I also don't want to let people get off without this issue with the national conversation coming up back in Texas. Speaking of Dallas, can you tell us a little bit about what this is and what people can do to join?
Yeah, well, the first thing is I've had a number of people said, all right, this sounds great, this national conversation. We like the people that are going to be there with you. What's this really all about? And I told someone yesterday, I said, this is the first decisive step in the direction of building a real foundation for a third party. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean a party that's not created top down. We don't have any billionaires shoveling money in the direction of a party that's supposed to be responsive to them. This has to be built from the bottom up. And the national conversation is an attempt to go across the country. We start in Dallas, we'll go to other places, hopefully once every 90 to 120 days, talk to different audiences in the country, some in the West, some in the East, some in the South, and we'll share our views, and then we want to hear the audience express their views, because this idea of an alternative to the uniparty, which is really what we're all about, can't work if it's not bottom up. It won't work because somebody sits there and I've got $1 billion. This is what I think. Join me. No. We have to build something that reflects the broader consensus and thinking and needs of the American people. So this is the first shot out of the barrel. I don't know if it is going to work. This is an experiment. People have said to me, well, you're asking money, a lot of money for this. Well, we have to because this is a nonprofit. We've had some contributions from people, but we've got to pay for everything. The food, the wine, the beer, the soft drinks, that's free. All you have to do is show up. You've got to have tables and food and all these things. But then we have to pay for everybody to get there that's going to entertain you and ask you the questions and solicit you for advice, which is really what we're about. We're not just there to say, here are the solutions to all your problems. We're going to express our opinions. Then you are going to have an opportunity to get on the mic and tell us what you think. And I fully expect that some people will say, we think you're full of crap. And this is what we think the real answer is. If we don't, then America has fallen on hard times.
Well, it's awesome. I'm a big supporter of that, and we'll certainly promote that here because it is desperately needed. And I agree with you. Somebody like Elon Musk, who said in a fit of anger after he got out of the Trump argument that he's going to spend billions of dollars and form this new party. Nobody's going to follow another rich guy that is just kind of a pouty face. They're going to look for somebody that can actually solve problems. And so I'm a big supporter of this, and I recommend anybody in our viewing audience here that's from the Dallas area, by all means, go there. This is thenationalconversation.org. Go and check them out.
And they'll be in the Frontier of Flights Museum, which is a very impressive museum.
Yeah, that's just outside of Dallas left field, if I'm not mistaken, close to downtown.
Right.
Wish I could be there, but we'll certainly be.
Why not? Come on, pack it up, get into your pickup truck and drive on down.
I might do that. Well, let me see if I can
fill it up with others. Bring them along.
All right. Thanks a lot, Doug, for coming on. And we appreciate you guys. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that on your way out. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.